Oh, I'm looking forward to...
This. Cool it. Freeze. Cool it. Dodge this. Freeze. Cool it. Freeze. Cool it. Freeze. Cool it. Dodge this. Cool it. Freeze. Dodge this. Cool it. Freeze.
So as you guys know, Hu Tao is getting a rerun banner finally after quite some time in the second half of this very patch. Now with that in mind, I've seen a lot of people having conflicting opinions of Hu Tao. I've seen a lot of Hu Tao slander happening recently, especially in like the Dendro meta or whatever, and a lot of people conflicted on how good she is and how good of a main DPS she can be for your account at C0 as a free-to-play, and also questioning how valuable certain upgrades like Homa and C1 are. And so in this video, we're going to be covering just that, how good Hu Tao is as a unit, her value as a character as a main DPS, how good she is overall, both at C0 and with her upgrades, and if I believe they are necessary, and just my overall thoughts on Hu Tao and her power level. Before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and without further ado, let's get into it. Now, starting things off, I want to talk about the positives and kind of define Hu Tao's role and place in the meta. Hu Tao is a strong on-field power DPS who specializes in doing really good single target damage by spamming charge attacks and vaporizing all of them when paired with a Hydro support like Xingqiu, Yelan, or both of them. While we'll get more into the teams a bit later, the main thing I want to emphasize is that her single target damage is really good, while also having ways to deal with AoE content against multiple enemies, like a burst that does good AoE damage, charge attacks that can dash through multiple enemies if you line them up, and certain team comps that can help in AoE, like pairing her with Shangling or Kazuha. Generally speaking though, the vast majority of her damage and where she shines the most is single target against bosses or abyss foes.
A reward on the road.
Enemy, which to this character's credit has been getting more and more common. Like pretty much every abyss in recent history has had bosses at a place for a single target character. Now while Hu Tao does have more strengths that I will talk about, the main issue that we have to discuss is, well, what are the alternatives? How worthwhile is she compared to other characters and other teams that you could be using? How good is she at C0? Does she need constellations? Does she need Staff of Homa? And how worthwhile she is as a unit? Well, I want to start by saying that for single target DPS, she is definitely one of the best. Part of this is because of the scalings on her charge attacks when paired with her skill, and also because her burst is really good. But another part of this is because of the Vaporize reaction, which you can proc non-stop when paired with really powerful Hydro supports who are also very good at single target. Like for example, Xingqiu's DPS is insane, everyone knows this, and so is Yelan's. Having these characters as off-field supports, or at least one of the two, does contribute to a big part of your team's damage, making Hu Tao teams generally pretty good overall, especially in single target. Now with the release of Dendro, however, we have the Hyper Bloom reaction. Hyper Bloom is a single target reaction, a reaction that occurs when you use Electro on a Dendro core, and that will hit one enemy and do a really good amount of damage, scaling on your character's elemental mastery and level. And because of how prevalent Hyper Bloom teams are in the meta and how accessible they are, like pretty much any account can make one, you just need any Hyper use, and Hu Tao is a good character for your account, but not a necessary one, right? I really want to specify this. While I'll go into more detail throughout this video, she is definitely a good character who has her place against certain enemies and just overall as a main DPS, but is replaceable with other units like Shangling, for example, who's free to play and better at AoE and a broken power carry overall, and then Hyper Bloom for single target, which almost everyone has access to. Now with that said, Hu Tao's strength does obviously depend on how much you actually build her, how much you invest into her, and what, like for example, weapon you're using on her, what constellations you have, and how just much investment, how much you actually build her supports, and her teams. While this is the same for many characters, with Hu Tao there are some pretty important upgrades, I guess, that are really good for your overall DPS, but that are not necessary. Generally speaking, Staff of Homa and your first constellation are two upgrades that can be very significant to your Hu Tao's overall DPS, with both of these upgrades sometimes giving you 20% or more damage than you otherwise would have, just generally speaking, but this obviously can depend. While I'll cover which one is more valuable, if that's what you're wondering, neither of them are really necessary to have a functioning and strong DPS. Now, the value of each can depend. For example, there are other weapons that can be good for Hu Tao, like a Deathmatch or a Dragon's Bane, especially if you have refinements, or some other 5-star weapons like a Jadewing Spear or even the Staff of Scarlet Sands. Because of that, there are many good options for Hu Tao, but if you don't have any of them, or if you just don't have the best options overall, then Staff of Homa can definitely be a big increase. And honestly, even if you do have like some of the other weapons I mentioned, Homa can still be a big increase of like 20% or more sometimes. So it definitely is a really good weapon, especially when you compare it to other characters' signature weapons. It is a big DPS increase for your character, but that doesn't mean it's a mandatory one. Hu Tao is a 5-star carry, even with a 4-star weapon does well. As you can see from the footage in the background where I'm using a Dragon's Bane, my Hu Tao is still performing excellently, even if I don't have Staff of Homa. Now with that said, given how prevalent this weapon is, a lot of people's images of how Hu Tao performs, how good she is kind of dependent on Homa since it's so prevalent, but overall I don't believe she's dependent on it, although it is a good upgrade if you want to get it. Now with that said, I would argue that while Staff of Homa is more versatile and good on pretty much any Poon user, for your Hu Tao specifically, your first constellation can sometimes actually be better because it allows your charge attacks to consume no stamina, allowing you to do dash cancels instead of jump cancels. While jump cancels can be more annoying and a bit trickier, as you have to jump as soon as you do a charge attack, it's something that you can get used to, and I see some people over-exaggerating the difficulty. Where the problem also lies, however, is that it is very annoying because because you have to use all of your stamina on charge attacks, and you don't want to use stamina on dodging. What this means is that it's literally a DPS loss to dodge, because that means you can do less charge attacks, which kind of forces you into running a shield. If you're not running a shield on a C0 Hu Tao, your damage tends to just be lower because you get to do less charge attacks because you have to dodge enemies' attacks instead of just tanking it with a shield. While this isn't a problem if you have a character like Zhongli or like a pyro shielder in certain teams, it's definitely a restriction to your team building. And even just apart from that, getting your first constellation is going to be DPS increase regardless, as dash canceling is more efficient than jump canceling, and it just allows you to get more charge attacks in and have a smoother and more comfortable rotation. It makes Hu Tao a lot more fun and also just better. Being a similar increase to home run is usually what I prefer, unless you just want a good weapon on your account. Now, while I really felt like it was important to talk about those two upgrades because I get asked about it all the time, I want to kind of stay on track here and emphasize that you don't need them. A free-to-play Hu Tao is still fine, and while yes, she may not be as needed on your account because you can go Hyper Bloom for single target or play Shangling for Shangling because she's broken, she's still going to be a very functional and strong DPS. And then if you do get C1 and or Homa, one of the two or both, she definitely jumps up in power level, and with both of them is definitely a really strong unit, even meta-wise, as pretty much every Abyss rotation has single target bosses, where she is definitely one of the best options, especially if you build her teams correctly. And so while those are my thoughts on her place in the meta, I do need to emphasize that the upgrades are valuable but are not needed, and while support characters are usually the best additions to your account as just a safe pull, someone like Nahida, Yelan, Kazuha, who you'll pretty much never regret unless you just choose to not use them, a DPS character who you use for a long time can be valuable but is never a necessary pull, and I kind of want to get that message across with Tao. She's a good character who has her strengths and has good upgrades that you could get if you want, but is not a needed one, so good if you like, but don't feel forced to get. Now, other strengths that I feel like I should mention for Hu Tao are the following. First of all, for your artifact sets, there are kind of many options. Like, yes, typically you want to go Crimson Witch of Flames, but it's actually a lot easier to farm this set now than it is in the Strongbox, so you can farm any domain you need for your other characters, and then just throw the bad pieces into the Strongbox and get a Crimson Witch set for your Hu Tao just passively as you're building your characters. Another good example is that many supports in the game, like some of Hu Tao supports like Xingqiu or Yelan, can need the emblem set, and while you do this, you could get a 4-piece from Essence, which while yes, is very annoying, and I don't really like it for a C0 Hu Tao, it can be very viable and sometimes even your best option, as it will greatly increase your charge attack damage, despite it draining your energy and being a bit annoying to play around. I'll include more information on this and her builds in general in my Hu Tao guide, which is coming out soon, but for now you should know that you can go either of these 4 pieces, and both of which you can get kind of passively from either doing the Strongbox or farming emblem, or you can mix and match 2-piece sets like Crimson Witch with a EM or a shield for your C0, and many variations. You could swirl Pyro with certain Pyro characters, use a shield option like Zhongli, or a more offensive option like Kazuha, or even Shangling if you're running double Hydro. Double Hydro is very good with Hu Tao, but is obviously not needed, and if you just use Xingqiu, that is more than enough. While I will cover way more teams in my updated Hu Tao guide, as I mentioned earlier, the point that I want to get across is that your Hu Tao can be very powerful hyper carry as long as you enable her to proc reactions like Vaporize with a Hydro support, and then you just build her artifacts as good as possible, stack crit, elemental mastery, and HP, and you have a powerful hyper carry. And so overall, is Hu Tao worth it? Is she a worthwhile addition to your account? Well, honestly, it does depend. I can safely say that if you want a main DPS character, Hu Tao is definitely a solid option and a good addition as a DPS if you need a DPS and if you like the character. This liking the character part is obviously important because it's a gacha game and you should play who you like, but also meta-wise from a power level perspective, she is definitely adequate, but does get significantly better and closer to what we call meta with her first constellation and or Staff of Homa. Even without it though, she's pretty strong, especially in single target, but not a needed character. I can't stress this enough. There's so many other meta teams that can work both in single target and in AoE, and other support characters who I would call more valuable than pretty much any DPS and better additions overall to your account, like as we said earlier, Nahida, Kazuha, Yelan, or other Hydro supports that you might need like Kokomi. But as far as main DPS like hyper carries go, Hu Tao is a good option. And so that is my sort of nuanced take on Hu Tao, and personally I've always really liked Hu Tao. Like my Hu Tao in particular is very well built. I've been using her for a long time and have good artifacts, a good ratio on her. I get a lot of value out of my C1 Hu Tao, but she isn't a needed addition to your account. She's a good hyper carry option, but as I said, pretty much anyone can replace her with something like a Hyper Bloom team, a Dendro reaction based team in general, or Shangling, who you get for free, assuming you build her correctly. And so yeah, those are my thoughts. I don't want to oversell or undersell a character. She's good, not needed, but can be worth it depending on who you have and if you want another main DPS character. I hope I did a good job at providing you guys nuance with her strengths and weaknesses and my thoughts on her and her value overall. With that said, stay tuned for my updated Hu Tao guide coming out later this week. And with all that said,